architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we try and have a conversation to advance the frontier of architectural thinking, and that is certainly something we are going to be doing today. In my conversation with University of Washington Assistant Professor Radhika Govindrajan, who has recently published a fantastic book on interspecies encounters called Animal Intimacies, of the time and work she spent working with the communities of northern India. We take on a broad range of topics and try and connect them to architecture, including human-animal relationships, the architecture that surrounds that, and sacrifice. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Let's go. Well, first of all, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you.
So we are talking about your book called Animal Intimacies, in which you talk about interspecies relatedness, or really interspecies intimacy, as intimated by the title of your book. And it seems to me the movement from relatedness to intimacies, we could get very intimate. And you do have a chapter on bears. And bears, and it seemed from my quick reading of the chapter, that there wasn't actual sexual contact between the women and the bears. It was more the sort of empowerment and constructions of women's sexual identities through, it seemed to me, fantasies with the bears. But that's not the same as actual bestiality, right?
So, I think it's hard to, the very category of bestiality, right, is such a modern one and comes through the law. I think it's interesting to think through what kinds of sexual encounters with animals are considered kosher and which ones are considered beyond the law.
Right.
And so if you think about, there's a very interesting historian called Gabriel Rosenberg, who has written this book called The 4-H Harvest, and he's been writing a lot recently about the ways in which animal reproduction on farms involves a lot of sex work.
Yes, of course. Yes, that's
And
right. That's
that
right.
kind of sex work is protected by the law and enshrined as part of the process of farming.
Right.
And yet bestiality
Right.
is figured as something else.
Right.
It's figured as something depraved. It's
Right.
figured as something that is inhuman.
Right.
And so I find those kinds of categorical separations interesting.
Interesting means what? I mean, why is this interesting?
To me, the question of is there actual sex or not is less interesting than what sex talk about bears does and what kinds of possibilities it opens up. So it's hard, as I point out in the book, to judge the veracity of these tales. People there certainly thought of them as true. They didn't think of them as folk tales or urban legends. Every woman I talked to said that it was somebody in the next village who this had happened to. The half bear, half human children were born in a hospital in Almora or in Nainital or some other small town. So there was a kind of specificity to these stories that I found interesting. And I wasn't invested in following those up to see if they were true or not, but really thinking through what kind of work they did. What I found really compelling about the bear stories was not just that women were able to use sex with bears to try and make claims on their families, on their husbands, to push back against patriarchal structures, but also for what kind of desire was imagined.
Right.
And I think that the stories, particularly the tellings in which young women who were not actually using these stories to push back against patriarchal expectations yet, but were thinking through them for pleasure. And I write about this young woman, Asha, who was soon to
Very
be married.
forward.
Very forward.
Yes.
Yes, it was quite surprising for me actually how forward she was. But
you used the phrase, I was very taken by her. I read that first as I was taken aback by her. Then I went back and read it. No, you said you were taken by her.
Yeah, I was. She's a very captivating individual. She
Yeah.
was very playful, and she kept drawing us back to that conversation in ways that I found really taking, right, captivating.
Yeah.
And so she was always.
Why was that captivating?
Because many of the
For you?
tellings that I'd heard until then were about the pleasure, but they were also about, shaming husbands for their lack of desire, or shaming husbands for the ways in which they shamed their wives
Yeah,
for their desire and so on. And this
pushing
was
back on patriarchy, you said.
right, and there was very little of that in Asha's telling. Of course, that was a broader context in which this was occurring, but she really wanted to talk about what sex with a bear would be like. And it was a really fun conversation. It was fun to see her imagine these outlandish things. It was shocking in many moments,
Yeah.
right? We were all sort of gasping with laughter, but also almost embarrassed by the frankness of her conversation.
Almost embarrassed?
It was,
Or-
embarrassed, but
Yes.
I was on the verge of embarrassment, torn between my own desire to sort of take her seriously, but also embarrassed about having this conversation and not knowing quite how to respond in this setting where this conversation is not always standard.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was fun to be around her, fun to see
It's very
the ways in which she
transgressive,
was.
isn't it?
It is. And I want to be careful about not sort of emphasizing the transgressive nature of this too much, because there is sex talk. There is a lot of sex talk. Women will talk about sex with their boyfriends, their husbands, sex in general. But this much pleasure in sex with a bear, down to the minute details, was really unexpected.
Unexpected.
And that's what made it so entertaining and so captivating. And she just, this is some of it is just personality. Asha had a very captivating personality, but that was what really got me thinking about the other kinds of work that these stories were doing.
Right.
And I started paying more attention to those details in women's stories, where they would dwell for a second on the fact that the bear loved these women so much
Right.
that he would lick the soles of their feet.
Right.
Right, and why that level of detail,
Right.
and what work does that detail do when
Yeah.
you could just say very simply, a bear took a woman, had sex with her,
Yeah.
and then released her. But
What
there
are
was
its
just,
rest of its affect.
there was a wealth of detail there that I found.
So let's zoom back out, since we have started the podcast by going deep into detail in sort of one
Yes.
aspect, unexpectedly, of your research. So you talk about interspecies relatedness. You quote Donna Haraway quite extensively, and many others. But Donna Haraway I know a little bit about, so I can connect there.
Yeah.
And you describe this concept of relatedness, picking up from Haraway, as the myriad ways in which the potential and outcome of life unfolds in relation to that of another. And here, another is not just you and me, interhuman, but it is interspecies, in particular animals and people. But it could also, I imagine, be plants and people, or plants and animals, and sort of the whole spectrum of interrelatedness across species. Correct?
Yeah.
Why is this important? I mean, why is this suddenly such a big topic for you and in theory, cultural theory nowadays? So what is the significance?
I think the distinction between nature and culture, human and other, has been used for so long in formations of race and gender and sex. And so I think that this questioning of these boundaries emerged actually very early in the work of critical race theorists and in the work of feminist theorists, who were trying to understand why it is that the natural was such a fertile site upon which to etch these boundaries of racial and sexual difference.
Right.
And so in a way, I think the seeds for what is this sudden flourishing of interest in the non-human have been laid well before
For
that.
a long time, yeah.
I mean, if you read someone like Frantz Fanon,
Of course.
he's very attentive to the fact that colonialism is predicated on the animality of the colonized.
Right.
And he writes a lot about the zoological metaphors of the colonizer. The reptilian stench of the natives is one phrase he picks up from the colonial record. And so I think that interest in how animality race and gender are connected,
Right.
as something that goes back along.
Right.
And so there's that kind of early history for the field. And then if you look at the work of, say, someone like Donna Haraway, she comes to her questions from that broader interest. So her Cyborg Manifesto
Right.
looks at exactly those questions about what kinds of distinctions does
Right.
the investment in the human allow for,
Right.
and what might undoing the coherence of the human as a category do
Right.
for thinking through these other ways.
Right. Right.
and
So what
so-
does it do? What does undoing the coherence of the human as distinct singular do?
I think it reminds us that the human has never been a stable category, and
Yeah.
that who gets included within the human is a question of power.
Yeah.
But there's also the idea that you can undo species difference to think about gender difference, race, and class. So it throws older questions into focus by unraveling the naturalness of categories like gender or the naturalness of race. But I think it also allows us to understand the ways in which the human is formed through these relationships
Right.
with other kinds of beings. So there's that question of how the human is separated into racial class categories. But there's also the broader question of how humans are never formed alone, but are always formed through relationships and interactions with all kinds of other non-humans.
With all kinds of other non-humans. So what is it to be human from this perspective?
To be human from this perspective, and I'm going to paraphrase one of my favorite anthropologists, Anna Singh, is to recognize that to be human is always to be in an interspecies relationship.
Okay.
That
But that we
human
know.
nature is
Yeah.
essentially a more than human relationship.
Right.
And to understand what it means to be human, we have to think through how that category is shifted over time, but also how the investment in separating the human from the non-human is one that has led to all kinds of
Problems.
problems.
Patriarchy, philogocentrism.
Yeah.
We got that. But I'm very interested in, so what is the new world of desire that this opens up? What is the new possibility of being in the world that this enables? What are the sort of ways in which we can start thinking about our agency in the world through this? For me, let's say, how can we think of architectural design agency through such concepts? That's what I'm trying to do. So
So what do you think? How do you think about architecture and design through such concepts?
Well, it offers me an opportunity to rethink old shibboleths like Louis Kahn, talking to a brick. So the logo of my podcast now, if you go to my About page, it shows me talking to a brick. And Louis Kahn used to ask, we have to ask a brick what it wants to be. And he said, when I asked the brick what it wanted to be, it said it wanted to be an arch. So, and we always thought this was a funny sort of strange modernist narcissism to think you can speak for the brick. Right? This is how I've always assumed it to be.
Yeah.
But through these categories, I can certainly start saying, oh, well, maybe the old man was actually talking to the brick and had a certain connection, and that indeed the whole point of architecture is to explore and express the human brick interrelatedness, because that's design. Because anybody can engineer a bridge.
Yeah. But you have to think with the materiality of the materials that you're working with. There are
Yeah,
constraints
with.
placed on on
Right.
what humans can do alone.
That's right.
So any kind of engineering is a process of working with other kinds of beings and objects,
That's
and
right.
working
Or
within the
to think
limits that are
about it
set
in
by
that
them.
way, yes.
Yeah.
Right. So it sort of offers a non-Heideggerian way to connect materiality of the things that we deal with.
And I think it offers us a reminder that the ambit of human intentionality goes only so far. That human intention has to rub up against, be constrained by, and work with other
Right.
kinds of intention, if you will, other kinds of instincts.
That's right.
And that, I think, is a really valuable intervention that comes out of thinking in these ways.
So I'm imagining myself in studio and I'm trying to suggest to a student, no, you must talk to the brick and the material and the stones. And you know, I'm looking at that student looking back at me and thinking I'm cuckoo, right?
Yeah. Well,
So I'm trying to give them examples from.
Well, I've been taking
from
a ceramics
your
class
studies.
recently,
Yeah.
and it's been really interesting to work with clay and to realize the difference between different kinds of clay. And I'm very much a beginner.
Okay.
But different kinds of clay
Yeah.
work in different ways. They
Right.
have different thickness, they rise in particular ways, they hold together in very distinct forms. And that has been really interesting for me because I've had to reimagine what I want to make according to the form of the clay that I'm working with. And there's always something unexpected that happens.
Right.
Different kinds of clay fire differently. Every object I make comes out differently. And part of that is the chemistry of the clay,
Yes.
you know, the ways in which the clay works against my fingers. So it's really made me think in a very minute way outside of my usual sphere of intervention.
See, we teach that, and that sort of lends itself, from my perspective, to the traditional mastery over the material. So there are masters who understand different kinds of clays and their chemical properties and their conductive strength, holding strength, so on and so forth, and then we sort of engineer amazing structures out of that. But that's not what you are talking about.
No, I think what I'm talking about actually is that even masters have to work with materials and have to learn the limits of those materials. And there's always an element of something unexpected that can often frustrate the best of human intentions.
Sure.
So I've been thinking about this in a very different context with bovine flatulence.
Bovine flatulence.
Right, so bovine flatulence.
Bovine farts, you mean?
Yes, and usually it's mostly burps.
Right,
But
and this is where the methane comes and everybody talks about.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So methane is a huge concern, and
Right.
bovine flatulence releases quite a great deal of methane.
Right.
So a number of scientists across the world are trying to re-engineer cows so that they can be less gassy, and they're trying to feed them different things. And there was a very interesting newspaper article about some scientists in Europe who were trying to redo cattle feed. And feed them different things, and it seemed to work for 2 months, and then suddenly the bacteria in the cow's body went back to producing flatulence.
Okay.
And so I think that points to the ways in which the human actor has to constantly work with unexpected non-human actors, and that the best of engineering projects have an element of failure built into them because it's not human intention doesn't fully work in those ways.
You have quoted Donna Haraway again to say that in trying to figure out how we communicate or connect to non-human actors, that communication is gestural, never literal, always implicit, a corporeal invitation to risk co-present, to risk another level of communication. So before we try and risk another level of communication with clay and brick, let's return back to animals for a little while.
Yeah.
And talk about risking levels of communication. And you're certainly having sex with an animal is a certain risking. Let's just go back. You've written the book in a very proactively first-person voice sense. And I suppose maybe this is how it's done in anthropology nowadays. So I'm very curious. I mean, you've put your own stories, your own narratives, your own engagement with the people that you're looking at. You're the animals you ran with, some animals that scared the shit out of you, this, that, and the other, right? So tell us a little bit, how did you get engaged with this question of interspecies relatedness? Was it just because you read this in theory in grad school, or how far back can you go in your life to your, let's say, childhood, to when you first thought this was a good, important thing for you?
Yeah, there are always multiple trajectories that you can find. I've always been fond of animals. So that's definitely one strand of my own personality that has opened up many of these questions. What does it mean to claim to know an animal?
Right.
Can you actually know across that kind of difference? What are the limits of that knowing?
Were you 5 years old thinking about this question?
Well, I had a dog growing up, so I would think quite often about what he was thinking and what he was feeling. I did all the time.
Yes, and did he say anything back to you?
I think think he did.
Yeah,
I think he
yeah.
did. He was quite
Through gestural means, yeah.
through gestural means, through growling when I would crawl under the bed with him,
Yeah.
through all other forms of embodied communication. And that getting to know him was a process. And I look back at that now and I think about what it meant to get to know each other and how do you come to a stage where you can risk communication, to use Haraway's words. And the risks for me there are multiple, right? There's a risk of anthropomorphization, which is a question that many people raise.
Sure.
Do you really,
Yeah.
can you really actually
Are we
know?
smart enough to talk to animals? Somebody said.
Well, there's Franz de Waal,
Yeah,
whose
yeah.
work I love, and
Yeah.
he has a new book out. But are we smart enough to know how smart animals are?
Yeah.
Asks us why anthropomorphism is a greater risk than what he calls anthropodenial,
Yeah.
which I think is really a wonderful term, because one of the points he makes is that there is perhaps a greater hubris in imagining that certain qualities are restricted to the human.
Right.
That is a greater hubris than imagining that human qualities extend beyond humans to animals.
Right.
And I am really quite convinced by that. I think that obviously there are limits to knowing, there are limits to translation, but these are also questions that come up when working with humans. Not all categories are easily translatable. It's hard to know what other humans are thinking. It's perhaps at a different level for animals, but I think it is worth it to let loose our creative, playful imaginations and to be playful in thinking through that, all the while recognizing that this is not a claim to speak for, that there are that we are in many ways engaging in imaginative processes. But I think it's worth it not to be scared of the imagination.
Yeah, so let's take some risks here. Can you describe a time, an experience, a gestural event from your own pre-scholarly life or extra-scholarly life where you felt you had a mistranslated communication with other species?
Sure. I mean, I've been...
Besides your own dog.
I've been bitten by several dogs.
Okay.
Part of that, I think, is mistranslation.
Oh yeah, you talk about hatred and other things as also kinds of communication.
Yeah, and those are risks too, right?
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you try and establish communication, there are perhaps the beings that you want to establish communication with don't really want that communication with you.
Sure.
So I've certainly had multiple encounters in my childhood where I would go up to dogs and try and embrace
they'd
them,
bite you.
and sometimes they didn't want to be embraced and they bit me, which only seems fair if somebody's trying to force themselves on you.
But that wasn't fair. Didn't feel fair then, did it?
Probably not, but I did learn very quickly about how to establish communication
Right.
and what kinds of terms. So
Right,
it
right.
certainly taught me to be respectful and
Yeah,
to
yeah,
think
yeah.
longer about that, establishing that relationship. But we all have encounters like that in our lives when we're trying to work through our relationships with other beings. And I think whether it's working with machines and learning the ways in which certain machines work,
Zen Buddhism and the art of motorcycle maintenance.
there we go.
Yeah.
And so I think that those questions are ones that we navigate in our daily lives. And I think that opening up the realm of what counts as acceptable scholarly work and bringing these questions into the realm of scholarship is a really important one. And thankfully, there's been this very long tradition now of doing that.
Would you accept my sort of love for my car, my beautiful Tesla, as part of this discourse?
Yes, absolutely.
You
Why not?
sure?
Well, you have your own relationship. And, I'd be curious to hear you talk about how that works, how that intimacy works for you. I'm very much an anthropologist. For me, these are questions that are worked out
Right.
ethnographically. I'm interested in the particular instantiations of them
Right.
across time and space. And so, yes, I would be very interested in hearing about your relationship.
Well, most people
With your
would just
Tesla.
describe it as a standard midlife male crisis.
How would you describe it?
I don't know. I describe it usually as a standard midlife male crisis, but I say, so what? That makes good sense to me. And my Tesla and I have a very intimate relationship.
What are the forms of that intimacy?
Well, it's very comforting. I've told this story many times on this podcast, so the listeners are going to be pissed off. But anyway, in my Audi TT, I had a Bluetooth system which was motion activated. So that's the technical description. But the bottom line was that the moment I got into the car, it would activate and connect to my phone. And then it, in a beautiful female voice, would say, connected. So that just made me felt really good.
It sounds like a midlife male crisis. And your new car doesn't have.
And well, my new car doesn't do exactly that, but it does a bunch of other things. So, but I do miss that old connection.
Yeah, but you're forging new ones.
But I'm forging new ones. We're developing a relationship, and I feel happy every time I get into the car. So
There you go.
but that's not the same thing as what you're talking about. I
No,
don't
it's
think.
not. And I think there is something to be said about the difference between different kinds of non-humans and the difference between individuals even within species. You know, at many times our conversation occurs at this very broad level where the non-human makes sense as a category, but it really doesn't. Because to think of a brick and an
Right.
animal, even between animals, a goat and a leopard in the same way,
Right.
doesn't make sense. And so I think there has to be some understanding of how this intimacy, relatedness works with different kinds of beings. And again, to me, that's a sort of ethnographic question, but I'm wary of flattening
Right.
difference and assuming that against this category of human, you can transpose this very capacious category of the non-human.
Right.
We use it for convenience very often.
Sure.
But I do think that there is something to be said for specificity and for acknowledging the difference between different kinds of beings.
Okay, so let's turn to one of the ancient, haloed, and deeply, from my perspective, in the contemporary world, controversial kind of interspecies relatedness, which is the idea of animal sacrifice. And you have a full chapter on that, and you discuss it extensively in various ways. And that connects really well to architecture. Because if you look at the Greek temple, it's basically a institution set up for animal sacrifice, right? And you look at the foundations of the Hindu temple, it's also an institution of sacrifice. You know, the old Vedis of Arya times, etc. They were all sort of sites for sacrifice, basically, and mostly involved animal sacrifice of various kinds. But then there was also continuity. There was all kinds of sacrifices, and ultimately, sort of along a spectrum of Purusha, human sacrifice. Architecture as the instrumentation of sacrifice is a well-established lineage. So I'm very interested in this idea of sacrifice. Let me say provocatively, isn't it convenient to substitute yourself with an animal?
Yeah, that's a question that the chapter begins with.
Right.
And this is a question that many people there are asking, and I want to take that seriously. I think that question raises the bigger question of how do you account for your involvement in the death of another?
Right.
And what are the ethics of that? Can that be ethical?
Yes.
And it's a difficult question. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think animal rights activists are asking this question. Lots of ordinary people are disclaiming sacrifice because they're unwilling to accept the ethical trade-off, if you will.
Right.
But I do want to consider seriously the idea that sacrifice doesn't preclude care, love, or grief, or even guilt, for that matter.
Right.
And I think in contemporary discourse, particularly within some of the animal rights discourse, there is a sense that sacrifice can only be understood as an act of senseless violence against beings who are considered not sentient at all.
Right.
And I do want to push back against that and think about the ways in which sacrifice does activate and draw on relationships of labor and relationships of care for animals, and that the death of animals actually opens up, the killing of animals opens up a space for ethical thinking. And I'm interested, as an anthropologist, in what the nature of that ethical thinking is. It might be convenient, but it doesn't come without some form of reflection, intense critical reflection on human responsibility for animal killing. And it doesn't come without some attempt towards atonement. And there's a larger question of what does it mean to take life, but this is a question that has occupied people over millennia. Veena Das, the anthropologist, writes about how this question of guilt for animal killing comes up in the Vedas.
It does.
Yeah, and a
What
number
do they
of
say?
well, she argues that one of the questions that's raised there is what does it mean to kill animals? But she also points out that humans are also considered one of the categories of pashu who can be sacrificed.
Right.
So there is that sense that the distinction between human and animal is not quite stark there,
Correct.
but that there isn't any easy resolution in the Vedic texts as to how you atone for this. But there are discussions of care for sacrificial animals. There are discussions of what responsibility being involved in this killing then leaves for humans. What are the forms of connectedness and relatedness that emerge from being involved in that violence? So there's no resolution to that question, as there isn't in the book. But that question remains one that is very compelling. And it comes up in different forms, right? There are people who are refusing products that are tested in animals. But for instance, if you take antibiotics, you're killing off life.
Sure.
Right. So the idea that one cannot take life at all is a tricky one to enact. And so what interests me is not so much the purity of that question,
sort
but
of
how
a
people
genuine view
navigate
of
that.
that,
Right. But how people actually navigate those ethical conundrums that spring up around what it means to take life, how do you take it, and if you take it, how do you atone for it?
Okay, but you're speaking very much as that's from a scholarly perspective as an anthropologist, and you can look at how we, as your subjects in the real world, since I'm not an anthropologist, how we do it. But I'm also trying to push at how one could possibly imagine another kind of architecture, another kind of being in the world, which re-articulates our traditional relationship to sacrifice. Right? What are we talking about here? Are we talking about re-verifying ancient sacrificial practices through a questioning of sort of simple modernist shibboleths on sanctity of life? Or are we trying to get to another, let's say, post-feminist horizon in which one can think of some other way in which all life is engaged in some form or the other in sacrifice? I mean, do you have any sense of what let's say a 21st century, a new temple might be in this? You have a lot of pictures, nice pictures of architecture everywhere. You show shrines, you show cowsheds, you show this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of architecture actually visually in your book and by sort of anecdotal description.
Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think as the architect?
I'm very interested in redesigning the Hindu temple, for instance. It has not been done. The church has been significantly reimagined through secular modernism and then through post-secular modernism, and so there are all kinds of discussions about it. But there's none about a temple that I know of any significance. There are a few sort of bad abstracted Hindu temples in Bangalore and so on. But there isn't a sort of a deep reading of it.
I also do want to say, though, that the temple is not the only site of sacrifice.
Okay.
There are, in this particular context, sacrifice happens outside village homes. It happens deep in the forest, especially for the sort of nightly sacrifice to angry beings who are ghosts, spirits, all kinds
But is the location of where you do the sacrifice critical in that cases? And how it's done? And
very much so. So if
do you make a temporary little temple-ish thing to do that?
You don't make a temple, but you leave a little rag, a red rag.
Marking the spot
Marking the spot with a bell. But you don't leave a built structure.
Sure.
Other than that.
No, architecture doesn't have to be built
Yeah.
and permanent. Yeah.
Right. So I think that question of what architecture you're redesigning and what the classical form has been is an open one. Right? There are obviously sacrifices in some of the major temples, but there is also this whole rural architecture of sacrifice that is not focused on the temple. And so what would redesigning that look like?
Well, traditionally, an altar or a Vedi, and therefore by extension the entire temple, is simply an instrument that enables the purpose of the sacrifice to communicate to the non-human realms.
But that's in certain tantric forms as well, and tantric architecture.
Yeah, but the temple as such is that it's the instrument or medium of non-human, human to non-human communication, whether it's Devi Devtai or the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of darshan and temple working. You know, it's a magic device to be able to do that.
Right.
Now you
It's a
can call this
communicative device.
you can call this superstition. You can say whatever. It's not obviously it's not actually doing that, right? But I'm trying to imagine how one can rethink that as an instrument through this question of interspecies relatedness as a sort of a new theoretical view of things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, there are multiple other nodes along which temples can be opened up. The question of caste in India is really central. A number of the larger temples especially are sites of caste power. And, given that Dalits have long been denied entry to multiple temples, that question of what does a reimagined temple space look like is not only one that has to sort of take into account.
Okay, well that's an
interspecies.
anthropocentric question.
Yeah.
I'm interested in an interspecies question.
All right. In that case, I think the caste question is one that sort of remains important even within these discussions, because for so long Dalits have been animalized. Right?
Oh,
So if you're
okay.
thinking-
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
So to me, I think that, again, to come back to what we were discussing at the start, I think the question of the animal opens up the ways in which animality has been used to undergird caste supremacy, racism.
You know, my father was big into animals. And he always started with the story of, when he was a kid. Well, his mother died young, so I think that's part of the equation. But that he grew up in a joint family. And he was given the sort of task he felt, because he didn't have a mother, by his aunts to, milk the cow and look after the cow. He was given the low job, while his cousins were given the better jobs.
Yeah.
But he always would say that because of that, he actually really developed a very great affection for the family cow. And literally sort of became sort of his substitute gauma, mother. So that every time he left home or came home, this cow who was sort of tied to the pen outside the house was, would get up and be excited to see him. And now, having read your book, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sure that happened.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just making it up.
I'm sure it did.
And it was real affection, two-way, right?
Yeah.
And he also tells the story of that when he was sort of designing Chandigarh with Corbusier and Jeanneret, etc. He said, well, why don't we have cows in people's homes? And I think Jeanneret or Cobb just said, we are not going to have animals in the modern city.
Yeah.
So modernism has this sort of prohibition against the animal.
Right, and the desire to invisibilize
The
animal,
right?
yeah.
Only as meat and dairy and so on and so forth.
And you see that in the moving of slaughterhouses, for instance, to the outskirts of the city, and
So that has been successfully done. Even now, in our sort of food security movement in the United States, we only talk of growing tomatoes and vegetables. Nobody talks about bringing back the slaughterhouses into the apartments of high-rise buildings, which isn't,
Timothy Patcherad writes about this quite a bit, and I think you might find his work interesting. He talks about how the politics of sight works in slaughterhouses and what must be kept out of sight, and what in this moment when slaughterhouses are trying to deal with the growing animal ethics movement,
So does he
what
have,
is brought into sight.
So how would you propose to us So my father's solution was that the center of every neighborhood should be a animal farm, and that animals have to be communally held and sent in the medicine. But it was sort of his technologist solution.
I think that's a really interesting solution because it also, firstly, makes visible laboring animals and the labor involved in making animals labor for you. I think that then forces certain kinds of ethical reckoning.
Does it really? I don't see that reckoning anywhere here in the West.
I think people are trying to reckon with slaughter, with meat eating, for instance, and there are multiple ways in which that reckoning takes place. There's a question of environmental impacts of, say, beef, right, which is a very heavy industry. But there are also questions of animal life and the sanctity of animal life. So I think there are ways that there are reckonings. But again, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in the political, social, historical context of those reckonings and the effects they have. But I wouldn't say that there aren't attempts to reckon.
Okay, so let's say we have had the reckoning, and now we want to reimagine the slaughterhouse in Seattle, in your neighborhood in Capitol Hill.
That's beyond me, I think. I would be very happy to hear your thoughts, but one of the things that Pacharat talks about is the importance of invisibilizing slaughter, right, to contemporary slaughterhouses, and the ways in which that act of making invisible occurs. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what happens if we make it visible? Now, what form that takes is contingent and open, but I do think that what it means to make death visible and make killing visible is a really important question.
It's a very important question.
Yeah, I agree.
That's my sort of one of the big takeaways from, because all the sacrifices you describe in this book, killing was very visible. The whole community gathered, and then the sacrifices were done, and everybody saw it, and you sort of handed over the animal, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that legal attempts to control sacrifice have invested so heavily in the idea that its concealment is important. So the High Court's judgment in Uttarakhand on sacrifice declared that sacrifice in urban areas could not take place because it would have to adhere to slaughterhouse rules. So it would need to take place in a shed, and the animal would have to be killed for the purposes of provisioning food. And in rural areas where they recognize that slaughterhouse rules are harder to apply because they're mostly for urban contexts, they stipulated that the sacrifice of animals would have to take place in a separate area that had been set aside for that purpose. And so even there you see this modernist desire to set aside, to invisibilize. Because there is something shocking, I think, to the modernist eye about the visible spectacle.
So towards the end here, I want to ask, this invisibilization of the meat-producing animal and its, derangement of its labor and sort of inhumanity of its daily genocide. Do you think there's a constitutive relationship between that invisibilization and sort of the, let's say, fetishization of pets in dogs and cats in the domestic life of people?
There's a historian called Harriet Ritvo who has several very interesting pieces on the emergence of pet keeping as a distinct domain. And one of the things she notes is that it is fairly recent, and she is looking at Victorian England, that the idea of keeping pets in a particular way emerges, right? The idea that the pet is something that doesn't labor, for instance. So your cat or dog is not a laboring animal. And that's relatively recent because for very long, cats and dogs were also laboring animals. Cats were mousers, right? Dogs would take care of flocks, they would do other kind of work, and you see that now in the formation of breeds, except that work has been stripped away from from pet keeping.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is something significant about that separation between leisure animal and laboring animal.
Right.
And the fetishization of one has also made easier the effacement and the invisibilization of the other.
Yeah.
So I think there is an interesting connection there.
There is a connection, isn't there? So there's
Yeah.
a problem with our dogs and cats.
And I also think that there is, with that separation, you also see other kinds of formations of human difference emerge. So a lot of the slaughterhouses in the U.S. Are staffed by undocumented workers, and their labor is then employed.
Invisibilized, similarly.
Invisibilized, and also completely unregulated. Right, they work in horrific conditions, are often threatened by their employers to have ICE called on them. And you look at pet keeping and you look at the billions of dollars spent in that industry and the ways in which that industry is also sort of racialized, right? You think about which pets are allowed and which ones, thinking about pit bulls, for instance. And there's the work of one person in particular, Harlan Weaver, that I'm thinking of, who writes a lot about the ways in which American discourses and practices, legal and social, around pit bulls speaks to the ways in which race is formed in the U.S.
I see.
And so I think there are also, once you're thinking of these distinctions between leisure and labor animals, also all other kinds of interesting formations of race and gender that erupt around those. And so undoing that distinction also helps us think about those
I see.
disturbing formations of power.
All right, we're going to think about this for a long time. Thank you for being on Architecture
Thank you so much
Talk.
for having me.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.